What happens when a flight attendant demands that the man who portrayed Jesus Christ himself remove his cross necklace because it makes other passengers uncomfortable? The woman had no idea she was humiliating Jim Caviezel, the actor who endured real torture, filming the Passion of the Christ, the man who was literally struck by lightning while hanging on the cross for his faith. What started as a routine flight to Chicago turned into a moment so powerful that it would be recorded, go viral worldwide, and change everything for everyone on board. By the time they landed, the flight attendant would be on her knees begging for forgiveness, and Jim's response would restore faith in humanity for millions watching around the globe. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the secret that makes this story absolutely incredible. The cross around Jim's neck wasn't just any cross. It was the exact same cross he wore during the filming of The Passion of the Christ, the one that absorbed his blood, sweat, and tears as he became the most authentic Jesus ever captured on film. The same cross that was blessed by Pope John Paul II himself. And this flight attendant was about to demand he hide it like it was some kind of embarrassment. Oh, and before we take off on this incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching this from. We absolutely love seeing your reactions from around the world. And trust me, you're going to want to share this story with everyone you know, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This isn't just about one man's necklace. This is about something far more dangerous happening in our society right now. Every single day, millions of people are being forced to hide their deepest beliefs, their most sacred symbols, their very identity, because someone else might be offended. If Jim Caviezel, the man who literally sacrificed his body and career to bring the most important story ever told to the big screen, can be humiliated for wearing a cross, then what hope do the rest of us have? What happens when faith becomes something you have to apologize for? What happens when the symbols that give people strength, hope, and purpose are treated like weapons of division instead of beacons of love? This flight attendant had no idea she was about to trigger a moment that would expose the hidden war being waged against religious freedom in America. She thought she was just doing her job, following protocol, keeping the peace. But what she was really doing was participating in the systematic erasure of faith from public life. And Jim Caviezel, the man who endured real crucifixion scenes, who was struck by lightning, who dislocated his shoulder hanging on that cross for our salvation, was about to draw a line in the sand that would echo around the world. Because if we don't stand up for our right to believe, to express, to wear the symbols of our faith openly and proudly, then we lose everything that makes us human. This wasn't just a flight. This was a battle for the soul of our civilization, and nobody saw it coming. The main terminal of Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Thousands of travelers rushing in every direction, business executives frantically checking phones, families dragging oversized luggage through crowded corridors. But walking through this madness with an almost supernatural calm was a man most people didn't recognize. Jim Caviezel moved like someone who had found peace in the storm, his steps measured and unhurried. He wore a simple navy blue button-down shirt, well-worn jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. Nothing that screamed celebrity, nothing that demanded attention. To most passers-by, he looked like any other middle-aged traveler. Maybe a businessman heading home, maybe a father visiting family. They had no idea they were looking at the man who had literally embodied Jesus Christ on the big screen, who had endured real torture, real pain, real blood for his art and his faith. But there was one detail that set him apart from every other person in that terminal. One small piece that carried the weight of heaven itself. Around his neck, hanging just below his collar, was a simple silver cross. Not just any cross. This was the exact same crucifix he had worn during every single day of filming The Passion of the Christ. The same cross that had absorbed his sweat when he carried that 100-pound wooden beam. The same cross that was with him when he was struck by lightning not once, but twice during filming. the same cross that Pope John Paul II himself had blessed before filming began. This wasn't jewelry. This was a relic, a sacred reminder of the most important role any actor had ever undertaken. When Jim reached the first-class boarding gate, he stepped into the priority line like he had done hundreds of times before. The flight attendant on duty, her name tag reading Sandra Mitchell, looked at his boarding pass and then looked at him. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, her crisp uniform, her practiced smile all faltered for just a moment. She looked at the ticket again, then back at this ordinary-looking man in front of her. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone flight attendants use when they think someone has made a mistake. "I believe you may be in the wrong line. This is for first-class passengers only." Jim looked at her with those piercing blue eyes that had stared down Roman soldiers on screen, but his voice was gentle, patient. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Sandra checked the boarding pass again. Jim Caviezel, seat 2A, first class. The name was familiar, but looking at this unassuming man in his simple clothes, she couldn't place it. In her world of entitled celebrities and flashy displays of wealth, Jim Caviezel didn't fit the profile. No designer clothes, no jewelry except for that cross, no entourage, no attitude. She had expected someone who looked the part of a first-class passenger, and this man looked like he belonged in coach. After a moment's hesitation, she processed his boarding pass, but her eyes kept drifting to that silver cross visible at his neckline. Something about it made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite say why. As Jim walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, Sandra found herself following him with her eyes, that cross catching the fluorescent light with each step he took. She had no idea she was watching a man carry his most precious possession, a symbol of faith that had sustained him through the most challenging role in cinematic history. All she saw was a problem waiting to happen. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily into the California sky as passengers settled into their first-class seats. Jim Caviezel sat in seat 2A in perfect stillness, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, breathing deep and measured. He wasn't reading or watching anything, he was simply present, radiating the kind of inner peace that comes from walking through hell and finding God on the other side. The sacred cross hung openly against his navy shirt, catching the soft cabin light with each gentle rise and fall of his chest. From the galley, Sandra watched him with growing unease. She had dealt with countless celebrities over her 15-year career, but Jim was different. His quiet confidence and complete lack of need for attention should have been refreshing. Instead, it made her increasingly uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way passengers kept glancing at him with respect. Or maybe it was that cross, so simple, yet commanding attention in a way expensive jewelry never could. Whatever it was, Sandra felt compelled to act. She straightened her uniform and walked down the aisle with practiced authority. "Excuse me, sir," she said, stopping beside Jim's seat. "I wanted to have a quiet word about our cabin policies." Jim turned to look at her, his blue eyes calm and attentive. "Of course. How can I help you?" Sandra's smile was professional, but had steel underneath. "We have guidelines about displays that might be considered divisive in our shared space. We want everyone to feel comfortable during the flight." Jim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I'm not sure I follow. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" Sandra's gaze dropped to the cross, then back to his face. "Religious symbols can sometimes make other passengers feel excluded. We ask that personal expressions of faith be kept discreet, especially in premium cabins." The words hit like a physical blow. Nearby passengers stopped their conversations, sensing tension building. Jim remained still, processing what he'd just heard. "This cross isn't a political statement or fashion accessory. It's part of who I am." Sandra felt emboldened, mistaking his grace for weakness. "We respect everyone's beliefs. We simply ask that passengers keep personal expressions subtle. Perhaps you could tuck it inside your shirt." Jim looked down at the cross, touching it gently. His mind flashed back to the Passion 20 years ago. The weight of the wooden cross, the nails being driven inches from his flesh, the lightning strike as heaven responded to the story being told. This cross had been with him through every sacred moment, blessed by the Pope, soaked with his blood and sweat as he portrayed the most important figure in history. And now, a flight attendant was asking him to hide it, like something shameful. "Ma'am," Jim said, his voice gentle but carrying unmistakable strength, "I believe you're asking me to deny the most important part of my identity. If someone wore a star, moon, tree, or any other symbol, would you ask them to hide it?" Sandra's professional mask cracked. "That's not the same thing. Religious symbols are inherently divisive. They make statements about beliefs not everyone shares." Jim leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes directly. "The only statement this cross makes is that I believe in love, sacrifice, and redemption. If that makes someone uncomfortable, perhaps the problem isn't with the symbol." The tension was now palpable. Passengers were openly watching, phones positioning to record, and Sandra realized she was losing control. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Sir, I'm asking you one more time to comply with our policy. If you refuse, I'll involve the captain and possibly have security meet us when we land." Jim Caviezel, the man who had endured real torture to bring Jesus to the world, who had been struck by lightning while hanging on a cross, looked up at her with the same expression he'd worn when Pontius Pilate sentenced him to death on screen. "You do what you feel you must," he said quietly. "But understand this, the problem isn't what's hanging around my neck. The problem is what's hardened in your heart." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the engine noise seemed to fade as every person absorbed the power of those words. Sandra stood frozen, suddenly seeing herself reflected in everyone's eyes, realizing for the first time that she might have made a terrible mistake. The cabin air felt electric with tension. Sandra stood frozen beside Jim's seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger, while every passenger in first class watched the unfolding drama. Jim Caviezel sat in perfect stillness, that sacred cross catching the light, his devastating words still echoing. "The problem isn't what's hanging around my neck. The problem is what's hardened in your heart." Sandra's hands trembled as she fumbled for her radio. "Captain Rodriguez to first class, please. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The next 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Passengers whispered among themselves, phones continued recording, and Sandra retreated to the galley, her chest rising and falling with angry breaths. She had done everything by the book, so why did she feel like she was the one in the wrong? When Captain Miguel Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, the atmosphere shifted immediately. He was a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm authority that comes from decades in the sky. As he approached, his experienced eyes took in everything: the tense passengers, the recording phones, Sandra's defensive posture, and the man sitting peacefully in seat 2A. "Good afternoon," the captain said with natural authority. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I understand there's been some disagreement, and I'd like to hear all perspectives." Sandra immediately launched into her explanation. "Captain, this passenger is refusing to comply with our policy regarding divisive religious displays. I've asked him multiple times to conceal a religious symbol, and he's been completely uncooperative." Captain Rodriguez nodded, then turned to Jim. "And your perspective, sir?" Jim looked up with those piercing blue eyes that had stared down Roman centurions. "Captain, your flight attendant asked me to hide this cross because she believes it makes others uncomfortable. I told her this isn't a political statement. It's a symbol of my faith, and I won't hide who I am. I've been respectful and quiet." Captain Rodriguez looked at the simple silver cross hanging against Jim's shirt. Then he did something surprising. He sat down across the aisle from Jim. "May I ask you something personal? That cross looks like it has some history." Jim's expression softened. It does. This cross was with me during the most important work of my life. It was blessed by Pope John Paul II, and it's been my anchor through very difficult times. Recognition flickered in the captain's eyes, followed by awe. Jim Caviezel, you're the man who played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers finally made the connection. The quiet man being harassed for wearing a cross was the actor who had literally sacrificed his body to portray the Son of God. The irony was breathtaking. Captain Rodriguez stood slowly, his face carrying respect and barely controlled anger, but not directed at Jim. He turned to Sandra with absolute authority. Ms. Mitchell, in 32 years of flying, I have never asked a passenger to remove a cross, Star of David, or any other symbol of faith. Our policy is to respect religious expression, not suppress it. There is no rule against wearing a cross on this aircraft. Sandra's face went white. But Captain, I was taught we should maintain a neutral environment. A neutral environment means treating everyone equally, Captain Rodriguez said firmly. It doesn't mean forcing people to hide their faith. He turned back to Jim with warmth. Mr. Caviezel, on behalf of this airline, I apologize. Your cross is welcome, as is your faith, and as are you. Then the captain did something that sent shockwaves through the cabin. He reached into his shirt and pulled out his own small cross necklace, hidden beneath his uniform for 15 years. I've been hiding this out of fear, he said with shame. Watching you refuse to hide yours has reminded me what courage looks like. He addressed the entire cabin with authority and conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jim Caviezel, the actor who portrayed Jesus Christ and endured real torture while filming. Today, he's shown us what it means to stand firm in faith, even when the world tries to make you ashamed. The applause was spontaneous and thunderous. Passengers stood, some wiping tears, others reaching for their own hidden symbols of faith. Jim sat quietly through it all, humble and grateful. The tide had turned completely, but the real transformation was just beginning. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the cabin remained electric. Passengers were sharing quiet conversations about faith and courage, some pulling out their own hidden crosses and prayer beads that they'd kept tucked away for years. But in the galley, Sandra Mitchell stood shaking as she stared at her phone. The video was already going viral. Flight attendant tries to silence the man who played Jesus. The comments poured in by the thousands. Each notification felt like a punch, not from public humiliation, but because she could finally see herself clearly. When had she become the kind of person who would ask Jesus himself to hide his cross? Sandra remembered the small gold cross her grandmother had given her, the one she'd worn proudly through training, but eventually tucked away in pursuit of professionalism. When had faith become something to hide rather than celebrate? Her hands trembling, Sandra walked slowly toward seat 2A. Jim looked up with those same calm, compassionate eyes that had watched her fall apart minutes earlier. Passengers sensed what was happening and created a bubble of silence around them. Mr. Caviezel, she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. I need to ask for your forgiveness. Jim set down his phone and gave her his complete attention. Sandra felt tears beginning to well up. What I did wasn't about airline policy. It was about my own fear, my own lost faith. I asked the man who portrayed Jesus Christ to hide his cross because I became ashamed of everything I used to believe in. The tears flowed freely now. I watched The Passion of the Christ 7 times. I cried every time. And today, I humiliated the man who gave me that gift. Jim remained patient, letting her finish. Watching you refuse to hide who you are has reminded me of who I used to be, who I want to be again. Then, Sandra did something that shocked everyone. She slowly lowered herself to her knees in the aisle, looking up at Jim with tears streaming down her face. I'm asking for your forgiveness as someone who lost her way and attacked the very faith that once saved her life. The cabin fell into profound silence as passengers witnessed a human soul finding its way back to the light. Jim looked down at Sandra, and when he spoke, his voice carried gentle authority. "Sandra, the beautiful thing about faith is that it's never too late to come home." He reached down and gently took her hands, helping her to her feet. "You don't need my forgiveness. You never lost your faith, you just forgot where you put it. Today, you found it again." Jim reached into his shirt and pulled out a second, smaller cross necklace. "This belonged to my mother. She always said faith isn't about the symbol you wear. It's about the love you carry. But sometimes, having a reminder helps." Sandra took the small cross with trembling hands. "I can't accept this. It's too precious." Jim smiled, his first real smile of the flight. "My mother would have loved knowing it went to someone who needed to remember how to believe again." As Sandra fastened the chain around her neck, something magical happened throughout the cabin. Other passengers began pulling out their own symbols of faith they had hidden away. A businessman revealed a Star of David. A young mother showed a crescent moon pendant. An elderly man displayed a worn prayer bracelet. One by one, they put these symbols back where they belonged, no longer hiding the most important parts of themselves. Sandra stood with tears of joy, Jim's mother's cross over her heart, surrounded by passengers remembering what it felt like to be unashamed of their beliefs. "Thank you for not hiding," she whispered to Jim. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." The flight continued in peace, but everyone knew they had experienced something extraordinary. They had watched faith transform not just individuals, but everyone who witnessed it. The real miracle wasn't captured on any phone. It was the transformation in the hearts of everyone who witnessed true faith in action. 3 weeks later, Sandra Mitchell sat in her modest apartment, recording a video that would be watched by 50 million people worldwide. Around her neck hung the delicate silver cross that had belonged to Jim Caviezel's mother, given to her in the most miraculous way imaginable. "My name is Sandra Mitchell," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "3 weeks ago, I was the flight attendant who tried to force Jim Caviezel to hide his cross. I was the woman who humiliated the man who portrayed Jesus Christ, and I had completely lost my way." She touched the cross at her throat. "I spent 15 years believing that being professional meant hiding who I was. But what I really did was erase myself. Jim Caviezel could have destroyed me that day. Instead, he gave me back my faith. This cross belonged to his mother, and he gave it to a stranger who had attacked him simply because she needed to remember how to believe again." Sandra's voice grew stronger. "I'm no longer a flight attendant. I resigned to become a counselor, to help others find their way back to faith." The video has been viewed over 200 million times. People call it a miracle, but the real miracle was watching a man refuse to hide his light and showing the rest of us what courage looks like. She leaned forward with intensity. "Since that day, I've received thousands of messages from people around the world. Flight attendants wearing crosses again. Teachers no longer hiding their faith. Parents talking to their children about God without apology. All because one man refused to hide his cross." Sandra touched the cross one final time. "If you've been hiding your faith, you have the right to believe openly, to express your faith proudly, to wear your symbols without apology. Don't let anyone make you hide the most beautiful part of who you are." The video ended, but its impact continued. Churches reported record attendance. The hashtag #Don't Hide Your Cross became a global movement. But the most beautiful outcome was a letter from 7-year-old Emma, written in crayon. "Dear Mr. Jesus Movie Man, my mommy saw your airplane video, and now she wears her cross again, and she's not sad anymore. Thank you for helping my mommy remember God." Jim kept that letter on his desk, next to the original cross from the Passion of the Christ. The story became proof that sometimes all it takes is one person with the courage to say, I will not hide who I am. And when that happens, miracles follow.